I want to start off and just say thank you to everyone for inviting me here this week for this lecture. I had been first approached about this back in February, and I was, tickled pink. I'll have to be honest with you, I have dreamed about coming to the SAR for decades, and I always wondered, how does one get there? Well, you have to get invited sometimes, but I am so happy to be here, and I have to say to y'all that New Mexico and Santa Fe specifically are so fortunate to have the SAR here. And tonight I'm going to tell you, as John said, something about one of the things that will probably be the thing that I'm remembered for in archaeology, good, bad, or indifferent, and that is the study of pirates. Let me tell you a few things here as we get rolling, is that why pirates? Well, part of the reason about pirates is because I never grew up, and I think that's part of being an anthropologist and an archaeologist, because we're following these passions. And honestly, I never even thought much about looking at the academic side of it until my dear friend and co-editor of this book, Charlie Ewan, came up to me after a Society for Historical Archaeology meeting and said, gee, people have been talking about doing something about a book on pirates, and, the problem is I don't even know where to begin. And I stood there and I rattled off about 6 different things right off the bat. And he said, why am I working on this book? All I remember is our childhood. We go all the way back to junior high school. And best men at weddings and godparents for children and all this. And he said, you do the book, but remember, it could ruin our friendship. Well, I'm pleased to say it did not ruin our friendship. We're still best of pals. And most of all, what came out of this book was something we're very proud of. And this is, to my knowledge, and I think to most others, I'm going to roll off on this, that'll be great, is it's the first time we've tried to bring together in a single location the study of pirates from the archaeologists that have done the studies. And one of the things that I'm going to come into you guys tonight is we're going to talk to you some about the archaeology, but I'm also going to be talking to you some about the fictions behind it and what we have to do as researchers to get beyond the fiction. And I look out here in this sea of faces as much as I can see in the dark, and I would say it would be fair to say that many of you remember Joe Friday. Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And one of the things you're going to find out very quickly is there's a whole lot fewer facts than there are fictions. So why don't we just push off here? Let the search begin. And this is dating me to my colleagues here from anthropology, but what kind of sources of information do we have, and what are we doing here? Well, I fancy myself a historical maritime archaeologist, and what that basically means to me is I'm interested in the last 500 years, and I am one of the handful of people, but there are more and more, and a lot of the folks are here in Santa Fe from Park Service, or some of them, that believe you can't understand the expansion of Western Europe if you don't understand how it expanded by sea and what that meant. And so I have always endeavored to try to take that into account. Some of the other things, though, that we have available to us in the way of our research are a number of different avenues of inquiry, if you will. The written word. I can look at documents that were written 200-300 years ago about various pirates. We have the spoken word. Well, of course, I can't go into my crystal ball or have a seance, though, I understand there are a few ghosts out at SAR, so maybe I'll have one tonight, perhaps after a cocktail or two. But we do have the spoken word as recorded by people, or by anthropologists and oral historians that came later. We have the observed behavior of today. Are there pirates today? If I asked you that same question 5 years ago, would you have the same response? No. And of course, we have the preserved behavior. That is the archaeological record. And that's what we have to work with. First of all, we got to dispel some things or lay some things out for y'all. The whole question of what is a pirate. And these are 4 terms that you see written up there. Many of you probably have heard every one of them. And of course, the first one, what's a buccaneer, other than the cost of corn, right? The term Buccaneer comes from the French word Buccaneer, and it refers to the French colonists, if you will, of what will be Haiti later, and the fact that they would capture animals and they would basically smoke them or barbecue them. And then when they weren't hunting animals, they would occasionally, go out and steal some stuff from a Spanish ship. And they were known as buccaneers or buccaneers. So there's one term. What about a privateer? What's a privateer? When I was living in California until 6 months ago, it depended on whose watch you saw this fellow. This is none other than Francis Drake. Francis Drake, of course, is seen as the great hero of England. God knows if he had made it back and not been jettisoned over the side off of Panama, they probably would have had him in St. Paul's and then Nelson in a side niche rather than him. But what is a privateer? Well, a privateer is basically an individual that is under the pay of a nation state. They supply their own ships, and they carry things called letters of marque, which at times of war allowed them to go out and make war on their enemies, only their enemies, and they did it in the name of their sovereign. And of course, everyone's seen the old movies of them coming back and Francis Drake bringing everything to Queen Elizabeth I, and everybody was very happy. On the other hand, about being very happy, there's another side that comes from it. What about the victims of him? And I'll throw this out here from the standpoint of oral history. One of the things that we did in the course of this book was we interviewed people, folks that were my parents' age, I'll say the greatest generation of the 1920s, 30s, and the teens, and asked them. We talked to baby boomers, and we talked to the 20-something crowd. And I want to comment that one of the boomers that I spoke to, a colleague of mine who was originally from Colombia, and he said that when he was a child, his parents would tell him, if you're not good, El Drake will get you. This is almost, 400 years after he died? And they're still bringing out the fact that Drake was a scary bad man that killed Spaniards. Keep in mind, for the Spaniards, he was a scary bad man. But what was he for the Brits? God save the Queen, right? That's a privateer. Now, as long as they're doing it that way, they're fine. Now, the pirate, there's the quintessential pirate, good old Blackbeard, as he was depicted shortly after his death. Edward Teach, a pirate is what we think of. A person who's without a flag, the ones that are against all nations. I'm coming up with all the cliches. These are the folks who will go out and they'll make war on anyone for a buck. It doesn't matter who you are. And then the last one, which I always like to put up here, and Charlie and I joke about, we're going to change this picture for a World War II aircraft. And just say, what's a corsair? Well, basically what they refer to as the so-called Barbary pirates in there. But another term for that along the way. Now that said, what about our images of piracy? Where do they come from? Well, one of the things that was interesting in these interviews that we did of various folks is I went out and I spoke to a number of folks that were, as I said, octogenarians at this point, and sadly some of them are no longer with us, but I asked them questions. And the key question I asked everybody was, I said the word pirate. Now tell me what you think of. And it was interesting, without missing a hitch, virtually every one of them, men and women, said, we think of Treasure Island, we think of Captain Kidd, we think sometimes of Tom Sawyer when he's dressing up to be a river pirate. Some of them might have recalled some of the Sabatini films with Errol Flynn in it, right? Captain Blood and such things. And it was very interesting. These were the images that came to them. And you can see those images up on the screen. And it was fascinating. I then went and talked to my age grade, the boomers. And I was fascinated because I talked to folks, again, men and women, some of them Latinos and Latinas, and every one of them said they thought about Maureen O'Hara, they thought about Errol Flynn, they thought about reading Treasure Island, but they remembered now I'm blanking. Who did Peter Pan flying across the stage, the original actress? Mary Martin flying across the stage. One had actually seen her in New York, and the other had seen her on the Ed Sullivan Show. Boy, that dates us, right? We remember Ed Sullivan. They shared these things, and for a moment it confused me. Holy cow, here's something, some of these books are being written in the 1870s, right, with Tom Sawyer, and Treasure Island was just shortly later in the 1880s. And we're talking about folks that basically we mark going up to 1964 as the time of their birth. And then it hit me. And again, I look at the crowd out here, and I don't suppose any of you actually remember that there used to, at most, be 3 television channels. Oh, okay, I guess so. And when I used to live in Colorado, there was 1. And I think we had a tin can for a phone because we had 4-digit number. Good God. And it hit me. When I was a child, I read the same stuff my parents read. The movies that my parents went to in the 1930s for a nickel or a quarter, that was all there was to put on those 3 channels. And we watched and grew up with the same images, the one exception being Peter Pan, because it was brought out by Disney and others. But so we're starting to get these images that are shared. And of course, one of the things that we notice is it doesn't hold true for the next generation, but as you can see, the stereotype does continue, though we all agree we love the Muppet Treasure Island, but Treasure Planet really stunk. So, don't give that to your grandchildren. Now, what about this? Oh, I love this. One of the things that we did as an outgrowth of this project is we said, well, how do you get these stereotypes? And we started thinking about Walt Disney. Who can't think about pirates now and think about Walt Disney? I got to stand over here and bump my leg up for a second. One of the things that we looked at is, of course, the phenomenon of Pirates of the Caribbean, the ride. And what it came very clear to us as we looked at it is that this ride was, of course, put together by the greatest generation, their Imagineers that would have been in World War II. The front half of it, with the skeletons, is taken virtually right out of the book Treasure Island. And if you look at these quotes, and they're talking about here, the great excavation, not very recent, the sides had fallen in, the cache had been found and rifled. And there's the empty chest. The human skeleton lay with a few shreds of clothing on it, and if you remember from every permutation of the movie Treasure Island, it's always spoken with a thick Bristol accent, and it goes, "He was a seaman," said George Merry, who bolder than the rest had gone up and was examining the rags of clothing. "Leastways, this was good sea cloth." Shit, I mean, everybody sounds like that. All our colleagues call us and go, "Arr," it's just... I'll tell you, it's good having a name Russ because I just sign off R. Anyhow, so if you look at the rest of the ride, and if any of you have ever been to Disneyland, and probably you have, God knows we live in the United States. Later on, you come to the point of the auction of the women, and the redhead is none other than Maureen O'Hara. And partway through, who's the guy who's being dunked in the well? Walter Slezak, who always paid the Spanish alcalde or governor or whatever else. Today, of course, we have Jack Sparrow. God knows we tried to ride his coattails with this book. But if anyone knows him, tell him to make sure the check's in the mail to us, okay? So we have this image today. The lure of buried treasure has captured many people through time. There's this Oak Island, which is off of New England up in Maine. People have been saying that that's where Captain Kidd held his treasure years ago. People have been digging holes there, and dozens of people have died through time. No one has ever found buried treasure. Of course, there's also another part of this picture. Because of all these grand ideas, we also have the issue of some people believe that there is treasure there. And, of course, this is where the treasure hunters come into the picture. And I'm sure many of you have read in the pages of National Geographic about the likes of the late Mel Fisher and others who have been involved, perhaps Barry Clifford with the Witta, who we actually use in this book. There he is up there on the left. And the issue is that has come to a lot of problems for archaeologists and also for those of us in this field, and even people not in this field, because we even pose this question. And there's nothing worse than shilling for your book, but available at famous prices and in paperback. One of the things we looked at here, and we asked these questions in the book. I don't want you to think I'm lying to you. It's right here on the preface. We asked questions like, are treasure salvors the good guys? In some books, that's how they're depicted. That's how it is in National Geographic. Are they the good guys, or are they the thugs that take advantage of the little guys? The little guys being us, the people that want national parks, who want museums, who want these things. We also ask questions like, what of pirates in the past? Was Jean Lafitte, who I learned today was potentially the Sephardic Jew getting even with folks? That's another story I'll save for later. That was a good thing I learned. But the question we asked was Jean Lafitte a smuggler and a ne'er-do-well? Or was he closer to Yul Brynner's 1958 depiction in The Buccaneer, the great ally of the United States who turned the tide at the Battle of New Orleans? You know, which one is the most accurate? And it's very interesting because in a lot of the review of trying to understand these stereotypes, we even looked at things like our Cub Scout books. Thank God my parents never threw anything away. And there they were talking about famous people from your state. And everyone, you know, somebody was noble. North Carolina, Blackbeard. Jeez. My brother-in-law was a member of a fraternity, and he said, oh, our flag was the skull and crossbones. I said, why was that? Well, they were really cool because, you know, pirates are kind of like Americans. And Jean Lafitte was a pirate, and he fought against the British, and that's good. And I just think, you know, again, we're creating images, and as anthropologists, historians, archaeologists, we got to try to dispel them. And that's what we tried to do here with our book. There it is, the thing. And the first thing to pose to y'all, you're going to say, first thing, he's only getting started, but that's all right. Believe me, I'm long-winded, but I'll finish on time. The first thing is, how do you spot illicit behavior? Oh, well, contraband items. Okay, I'll ask this question. No one in this room has a Cuban cigar. No one has ever seen one in this country, because that would be illegal. You're laughing. The police will be coming in at the end of this. No one has ever seen contraband items. No one in the 1920s drank contraband booze. Okay? What about the location? Well, sometimes the location helps, right? A lot of times where illicit behavior takes place, it's in out-of-the-way locations. That might help. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it happens right in the park across the street. Right, John? Are there specialized tools that bad people use? We'll look at that. I bet they have special transportation. You know, pirate boats. How about special clothing? Well, yeah, they all have peg legs, eye patches, a parrot, and whatever else, hooks. And we always said, well, maybe we should just look for a shipwreck that has a keg of hooks on board. And then, of course, there was the issue, how do you usually catch illicit behavior? And, you know, with due respect to law enforcement, and believe me, we have to have due respect for them, but think about how most time they catch someone. Because someone tells on them. The Snitches. You guys are old enough to remember these shows. I love putting together this talk, you know? Yeah, Izzy, Angel, and Jesus from all the great TV shows of the 1970s and early 80s. You know, these are how they would catch these guys. Don't ask Rockford to go out and find them with good sleuthing. Someone came along and told them, or if you watch Magnum P.I., Ice Pick would tell them, you know? Steve. So, you know, this is how we find a lot of these things. So now we come to the question, what about the Blackbeard ship? Two of the chapters we have in this book are based on a shipwreck that was found off the North Carolina coast a little over a decade ago, found off the coast of North Carolina. Leave it at that. It is alleged to be the Queen Anne's Revenge. And of course, I read all the documents like everyone else, and I saw the exhibits when I went to the Outer Banks. And it's like, well, it works for me, but what do I know about Blackbeard? Well, it's interesting because some of the things that they've found on this is they said, well, gee, we know it was a large ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. According to accounts, it had something on the order of 40 guns on it. Wow, that's a big ship. That's the equivalent of a fifth rate in the Royal Navy. It's in the right location where we know he scuttled it. And gee, most of the artifacts look good for the date of around 1718 or so. But it's interesting because while we talked to some of the people about it, other people that worked on the same project as colleagues with these folks looked at it and said, well, it could be another wreck that we don't know what it is. It could be a heavily armed merchant ship. And they started looking at it, and there were items found on board the ship that, again, looked good, but one of the things they found was this gun. And guns are interesting. Those of you who don't know about sailing, of course, here in Santa Fe, you probably don't do much of that. But one of the issues that you have to run into with a sailing ship is you have to have it in trim. And that means if you have guns on either side, they have to be balanced out, because if they're not balanced, you go turtle and you die. And one of the things that was always very important was knowing the weight of the guns and marking them on there. And of course, here's this number, and gosh, it looks an awful lot like a 1730. The ship supposedly sank in 1718. Is this a date? Usually dates are cast into it or struck into it rather than scratched into it, or is it the hundredweights? From what I understand, the point is the question is out. But there was also found some gold on the vessel, a few other items, and the question was well, Blackbeard apparently basically scuttled this ship. Would he have scuttled it with all this valuable stuff on board? Hell, he's a pirate. Wouldn't you think he'd sell it? I mean, that was the story behind it. So the question is we put in this book point and counterpoint. Look at the evidence. Then we have another pirate ship, the Speaker, 1705 off the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And the Speaker was captained by an English captain, John Bowen. And the wreck, he was out there, and they got into tough weather, and they crashed on the coast. His men made it ashore, and at that point, the island was Dutch-controlled, and they basically went up and took the governor hostage and said, give us another ship, we're leaving. This ship was excavated in 1980, or this wreck site was excavated in 1980 by a fellow named Patrick Lizet, a French national. He went on it, and he said, and we asked Patrick a question. How do you know it was the Speaker? Did you find the ship's bell? No, Russell, that kind of thing. And it was like, well, no. Well, then, well, how did you know? Well, the document said it sank there. Now, my colleagues, like John, who work in prehistory, or David, who works on the cusp of prehistory, will say, well, thanks a lot. I can't do anything with this information. How am I going to recognize this in prehistory? What are we looking for? And that's where we come to it. And we look at the stuff that's found on board this ship. We find things like hand grenades. Well, you know what? We see them in the movies. Navies use them as well as pirates, these anti-personnel things. This thing has got guns on it, very nicely cast guns. Of course, these have got, I think that's the marks of France on it. So this is, it originally was at least made in France, and it seems to have been made at a royal foundry. So you go and you say, okay, so how did the pirate get it? Well, he stole it. Okay, that'll work, that's fine. Then you might go and look at the other items that are on the ship. Well, gosh, there are navigational dividers. That's a sundial, little handheld sundial. Clay tobacco pipes, and for Dave here, beads like we would find in North Carolina, right, Dave? And you go and you say, oh, yeah, well, and you look at it and you say, yeah, but any ship needs navigational dividers. They need to have the way to get the time. Our European assemblage, is there anything that specifically says pirate? So then, it came. So then you come to the big one. Well, there's treasure. And look, it's a whole mixture of different items on there. There's these Indian bronze figures from the south of India, the subcontinent. There is an Ottoman coin on the top right. There are Venetian ducats, and then a piece of 8 down in the corner, a bit or a cob. And you look and say, evidence that this is a pirate because he stole from everyone. Well, you guys are laughing because you know the reality of it is that until, the late 19th century, things are based on the gold standard. And basically, if it's bullion or specie, that's what matters. And again, all of us in here are old enough to remember 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, $1, all for Naperville stand up and holler. That was my high school. At any rate, no one quite remembers what that means, but what they're talking about are pieces of 8. And when there wasn't fractional currency, they would break them into pieces. And the fact was, we often know that Spanish coinage or Mexican-struck coinage was legal tender in this country until the 1850s. Gosh. I hope I'm not disappointing you. Of course, we looked at this from another standpoint. And the other standpoint we looked at it was from the standpoint of the victims of pirates. And I throw this out for your consideration. I know it's the 50th anniversary of Twilight Zone as well. We often think about pirates, and of course, some of you may also think about the other kinds of pirates. The pirates of the interior of the United States. I remember as a child, it's amazing again how pirates came up in my life. I remember as a child reading about how Abe Lincoln took a load of corn whiskey down to New Orleans and they were set upon by river pirates. And that's how he got the scar on his face. Where the hell that came from, I don't know, but that brain cell is still there and solid. God bless my second grade teacher. You also might remember the movie How the West Was Won, or a few of you may also have had your coonskin caps for Davy Crockett and the River Pirates. And of course, we can relive these days again with Walter Brennan taking the role. He was called Colonel Hawkins in here, but he actually was taking the role in How the West Was Won of a fellow by the name of Colonel Mason. And it's interesting because Colonel Mason had actually served in the American Revolution, and at the end of the Revolution had set himself up in Cave-In Rock, you can see a picture of it there, on the Ohio River, the southern part of Illinois. And flatboats would come down the river, and in the movie you'll remember Jimmy Stewart came down there, and there was a sign that said, "See the varmint." And they'd go in the cave and they'd go, "We're going to see the varmint." And they'd look in the hole and they'd bonk them on the head and rob them. So there it is. And one of our colleagues did some research. I knew you'd like this story. One of our colleagues, they found a flatboat wreck. And it was found, and everybody in southern Illinois still remembers how the West was won, because that was the last excitement that happened down there. I used to live and work in Illinois. I can say these things. And there is this flatboat, and they're looking at it. See, it was sunk, and they're saying, "Oh, and look at the stuff that was there." And you look at the assemblage, and the assemblage looks like any other frontier assemblage from the early part of the 19th century. Spoons and axes and wedges for making things. And the archaeologists worked on it, and people are coming up, "We know pirates sank it. We know it." And they look at the wreck, and they discover that there was a snag that had caught it from underneath and sunk the wreck. Were they involved? Could be. Don't know. Interesting stuff. But what about the other victims? This is my background with the Spanish colonial world. What about the other victims, the Spanish Empire? Within a few generations of Columbus, we know others came in. They wanted to get in on the act. The French, the English, later the Dutch would join them. We'd have Danes in there. And here's a great shot of none other than Sir Francis Drake basically laying siege to Santo Domingo in the 1580s. Now, of course, he was a privateer at that point, but he's laying siege to it. And according to many of my colleagues working on Spanish colonial sites, they will oftentimes point at the materials they find, and I got after them once, which didn't endear me to many, and they'd point and they'd say, look, we have these French items in this 16th century Spanish site. We have these other items from, well, we have these French items, evidence of smuggling and illicit behavior. And I said, okay, well, let's look at the collections. And I looked at the collections, and there was stuff made in Spain. There was stuff made in Mexico coming to these sites. There were these French items. There were some things from Germany. And, of course, there were some items coming from China. And I said, so if you're going to take that premise, then we had Chinese pirates here and German pirates. And I go, oh, come on, Russ, we know better than that. And I said, well, do you? And I went back and I did the history on it. And, you know, obviously Spain, under the Habsburgs, controlled Germany. Spain controlled parts of France and the Low Countries where some of these French materials are being made. Of course, Spain. Spain, of course, controlled the Manila galleon trade for 250 years. Could this be a sign of illicit trade? It could be. But are they seeing it because they want it to be illicit trade, right? Why? Because it's more exciting to talk about these guys coming in. And I said, maybe it's more parsimonious to just say natural trade. You don't piss off your friends and bosses with those remarks. But on the other hand, they point and they say, well, we built all these great fortresses to keep these pirates out. Well, I'm going to fill you in on something, sports fans. These weren't built to keep out pirates. These fortresses were built to keep out armies, or, if you will, militias from in here, whether it's Fort Matanzas and the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, this fortification at the mouth of Havana Harbor that I was at a few years ago, or the fortifications of San Juan, Puerto Rico. Boy, that brain cell went. But I remember Abraham Lincoln. So, you know, we have to ask these questions. Okay, if we find exotic items, how did it get there? And for those of you who are archaeologists, this is old news. What's the spatial and temporal context? If you have something that's 18th century and you know that they didn't have that, well, then that's a better case to build. But we have to think about shifting alliances and boundaries, and we have to think globally. I'm an old, broken-down Wallersteinian that really believes in world systems. And to me, as a person that understands or thinks about world systems and the birth of the modern economy, I have to understand that in its grand scale. And again, with due respect to my colleagues in prehistory, so don't get mad at me, I was trained in prehistory as well, but one of the differences is that prehistorians think very much regionally, because that's reality, that's their world. Once we start talking about the post-1492 era, we have to start thinking globally. What decisions are being made in the metropole that are affecting life in Santa Fe? You know, you guys might have been at the end of the earth, or at least you could see it from here, and that's with due respect, because I lived at Santa Clara, and they could see the end of the earth there in California. But the reality is decisions that were being made there affected y'all. And also decisions being made on the part of French traders coming down there with guns and such things for the native peoples of the Great Plains affected life here. So decisions are taking place that are outside the control of the local world. And that's something that we should keep in mind here. We also have to keep in mind as we look at these places like St. Augustine, that's at the edge of the earth, where trade could take place, and we know took place illegally between St. Augustine that sent loads of oranges to New York, and New York sent back Pace taco sauce. No, they sent back other goods of British production. So I was just making sure you're awake. At Grande Terre Island, where Jean Lafitte was involved with smuggling things into the back door of New Orleans, we find a whole variety of things, whether it's porcelains, Cologne stoneware from Germany, faience, Delft, and ceramics from Staffordshire in England. How can you be sure? In the case of Grande Terre, it's in Hellengon out in Barataria Bay. People don't live there. But what about legitimate businessmen? I'm a legitimate businessman. Last time I talked about this, I went through it and I said, so tell me, what's the special clothing worn by the Corleone family? And I said, well, nice suits. Oh, yeah. Okay, and they drive black Packards. And, you know, anyone here that's old enough remembers you can have any color telephone or car you want as long as it's... Thank you. God, I knew you guys could remember this. And you look at them, and of course they had guys there with guns to protect the place. We know how Sonny bought it on the way in on the causeway. But then I show you another famous family in the American world. Some people would say that perhaps he was less than legitimate. They live in a compound. They wear nice black suits and wore nice black cars, had nice black cars. And gosh, during Prohibition, he certainly had enough to drink. You know, legitimate businessmen. How do you spot them? What about terrorism? Well, one thing's for sure, with pirates, no one was safe from attack. We know that Blackbeard and a bevy of other pirates laid siege to Charleston. You can back me up on that, David. They laid siege to Charleston, and what they wanted was stuff to cure syphilis. And they blockaded the harbor until they brought out a chest of drugs for them. We can at least document that about 3,000 ships were captured between 1690 and 1720. At first glance, you might say, wow, that's a lot. It's 30 years, do the math. How many is that per year? 100? Is that a lot? And how did they suppress piracy? Well, the United States sent out a squadron of pirate killers right after the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s that went in there, and that's why Jean Lafitte was driven out of Barataria Bay to near Galveston, out of Galveston, and died down in the Yucatan. The British sent out their navy to the East Asia, and they patrolled the waters there and drove them out. So, how else could we recognize them? All right? How about personal items? Well, geez, what personal items would a pirate have that other sailors wouldn't have? Well, working clothes. Well, you can see there's a guy that must have been based on Long John Silver, the cook with one leg, wearing sailor's clothing. That's basically the working clothes. And I'm sure if anyone in here served in the Navy, you know that you had your dungarees for work, and you had your dress blues and whites in your sea chest, all right? You didn't wear your working uniforms, your fatigues. You did that for work. You had your going ashore rig. We also have to keep in mind is that until the age of Nelson and beyond, there were no uniforms in navies. People wore what they had, slops, as they say. Overall, if you are in a port town, a sailor looks like a sailor. You know, spot the pirate, it's not easy. And they were hard to identify unless caught in the act. Now, more recently, when I asked our folks about this, the post-baby boomers, the Gen X folks, what they thought of as pirates, many of them said, downloading music in my dorm room, software that I shouldn't have, and here you got to look at these great images up here. These are out of the pages of the San Jose Mercury News, from the business pages. Look at it, you know, Oscar with a patch and an eye, and software pirate. This is what we heard about prior to a couple years ago. This was what piracy was. No one thought about the other kind. But you know what? The other kind never disappeared. The other kind was very much there. Perhaps you know about Erich Klinghoffer, the man in a wheelchair of the Achille Lauro that was taken over by the Palestine Liberation Front. And in a great act of daring, they took the man in his wheelchair and tipped him over the side of the ship. They are considered not freedom fighters. That was an act of piracy because they were not from a nation state. The USS Cole, when it was attacked a few years ago, is considered an act of piracy because, for God's sake, Osama bin Laden's group are not a nation state. Some of the people we interviewed for this were from the Philippines, and the students I asked the questions to were at East Carolina University, Santa Clara University, and Ateneo de Manila in Manila, the university there, Jesuit school. And a few of them actually brought up their own pirates, part of the old legacy of the Moro pirates that the United States was involved in fighting after the Spanish-American War, Abu Sayyaf. Today, and for decades, but at least the last since 1992 that we can document, the hot spots have been the Straits of Malacca, the choke point between Malaysia and Indonesia in the South China Sea, and we all know about Somalia and the Gulf of Aden, the Horn of Africa. Why haven't they been able to stop these guys? No specialized clothing, hard to identify unless caught in the act. And here are the statistics that are reported, and I urge you, if you want a shot of reality, to look at the statistics for this week, and I show you the thing down here. Just type in weekly piracy report, and you will see the attacks that took place just this week. Look at the number of attacks that took place, not in a 30-year period, but in, someone help me with the math, 16 years. And here's the latest update. See, I came prepared for this, John. I got online with them, and we're talking here about economics, right? That's what this is all about. Well, it's quite interesting because this year, since obviously January 1st, there have been 294 documented pirate attacks. 144 of them took place in Somalia and the Gulf of Aden. Of those, I don't have my glasses right with me at this second, 4 people have been killed and 532 people have been taken hostage. But all we heard about was one U.S. flagged ship, and it was on the front page of the San Jose Mercury for the better part of a week. I want to show you some of the attacks. This is 2003. Here's 2006, off of South America, pirate attacks. You can see the attacks here in Southeast Asia, April 2006, off of Africa, coming up to date here. Here's Somalia, 2006. Here's 2008. This was for the whole year, 293. We've passed that already this year. That's what I just told you. You can see they're off of Africa, Southeast Asia. And the government of Indonesia predicted at the end of last year, based on our world economy, that there will be a rise of piracy tied to the collapsing economy. These people are thieves. These people are desperate. These people are willing to risk their lives because it was a hanging offense in the 18th century, and it still is a death sentence today around the world. And we are seeing this take place. And you can get on here, look at this. So if any of you are taking a cruise, in fact, some cruise ships came too close to Somalia this past year, and they were fired on. And there is a real controversy about should you arm these ships. And the thing they're afraid of is if you arm them, you're going to escalate the violence. So oftentimes these ships will go through the Straits of Malacca at night, big oil tankers, and the pirates will come up behind them in Zodiacs with grappling hooks and AK-47s. And the only means of defense is they will have spotlights and guys with fire hoses trying to keep them off. Otherwise, they'll come on board. If you're lucky, they'll steal your wristwatch, the petty cash that you have, rope, fire extinguishers, anything they can sell, and they'll leave. If you're unlucky, they'll kill you all, they'll take the ship to a breaking yard someplace and either break it or repaint it, reflag it, and take it out to sea. That's piracy. 2008, I've got to hurry up here. But of course, where do our images come from? I've already given you a lot. And of course, then there are these. All those books on the left my father used to read on those long DC-3 flights over the Pacific in the 1950s. And I read them years later, and you got to admit, it sure looks exotic. And you read Jimmy Buffett, and anyone that likes his music like I do, read these books and go, yeah, way to go, Jimmy. And they create these images. And we think about our heroes, right? We have the Pittsburgh Pirates. They didn't make it this year. You can remember the Pirate Bowl as it was sold a couple of years ago between Tampa Bay and the Oakland Raiders, who really stink again this year, as another one of our sets of heroes. And how do we teach our children? As I said, I used to live in the Bay Area. I always wanted to go to the Stanford Pirate Camp. And then we discovered that September 19th is National Talk Like a Pirate Day. I observe it, and in fact, my dear friend Charlie gave all his lectures that day in pirate. And he said, I was never so exhausted in my life. Thank God it fell on a Saturday this year. You know, it's not easy being from Bristol. Anyway, so remember that when you get to it. But what else do we find? I'm sure none of you ever go to Las Vegas, the Treasure Island Hotel, where you can watch the pirates and the English fight every time, and the ship will sink, but they come back an hour later and do it all over again. What are we going to look for? Do pirates wear special clothing? No. Do they have special technology or different ships? That's a qualified no. Many of the ships that we have found so far associated with pirates had actually been used in the African slave trade. And this is an interesting point to have for you all. You know, this is one of the negative sides, but you know, the issue of the African slave trade was this was a live cargo. And you want ships that can get the live cargo live back. And of course, the issue is having ships that can be taken right up to the shallow waters in Africa, get the enslaved Africans on board, and get it back fast. Now, think about why that might be a good thing for a pirate. You can take it into shallow waters where Royal Navy ships and other naval vessels can't go. They're damn fast, and they know that. So a couple of the ships, the Widow for one, and the Queen Anne's Revenge, were both ex-slavers. So that's sometimes something to look for. But is it a special technology? No, it's appropriated. And again, think back to Miami Vice. The guys driving the cigarettes weren't just out for a good time. The bales were floating next to them, all right? You know, do they eat different foods? No. Their success lies in their ability to blend in. The best pirate is a pirate that's never caught. Now you're going to say, what are we going to do as archaeologists? This is what upset our colleagues when we published this book, because we've had a strong sense in archaeology for the last 30 years is pattern. Look for the pattern. And we said, you know, so far the pattern's not jumping out at us. But one of the first things we have to do is understand where our biases come from. Try to weed those out of all those childhood memories and get back to being Jack Webb and say, just the facts. That's what we need to do. And what we tried to do in this book as we went through it, we asked everybody that contributed, how do you know it's a pirate site? And they all said, well, if it wasn't for the documents, we wouldn't know. And one of the people that contributed to this was Donnie Hamilton from Texas A&M University, working at the famous Port Royal, Jamaica. And he said, I'm going to throw you guys out of here for asking me to talk about pirates. I'm tired about people asking me about pirates. And we said, Donnie, you don't understand. We're asking you, can you really see pirates? And he wrote his stuff, and this comes from, what, about 50 years of research on that site, Bob Marks originally and others up to him. And he said, you know what? This is a prosperous English port. It looks like deposits found in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston from the same time period. Were there pirates here? Sure there were. But can we pick them out? No. And I think that's the important part. And I hope that may not be what you had in mind, John, but guess what? That's what you got. So, as we sail into the sunset, comments, questions, and scathing rebuttals. Go ahead, throw it at the cripple up here, all right?